Hello and welcome to another episode of Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Today we will be starting our program talking about Indian-occupied Kashmir and the communication lockdown, the curfews there that have been going on for over 5 weeks now. Today, the Foreign Minister of Pakistan, Mr. Shah Mahmood Qureshi, spoke at the UNHRC session in Geneva, highlighting the violation of human rights in Indian-occupied Kashmir, highlighting the news stories coming out from the region of international news reporters on the ground, local journalists, talking about the dire human rights situation as there is a blockade. He talks about how international observers are not allowed, how international reporters are facing so much difficulty in entering the area. And he has talked about a lot more, which we will be discussing in the show. But let me also just quickly recap. India hasn't allowed international or local journalists from reporting in the area. It refuses to allow UN observers to come see for themselves what normalcy that they are talking about. In fact, journalist Anuradha Bhasin, who is also the executive editor of Kashmir Times, which has not been able to print its Srinagar edition since August 5th of this year, has filed a petition to India's Supreme Court arguing that this lockdown is violating the very press freedom that the Indian democracy represents. In fact, in a recent interview with an American radio channel, she also spoke about how these curfews stop her workers from reaching the printing presses and elaborated on the kind of violence that is unfolding there in Indian-occupied Kashmir. But this is not the only time that we've heard voices condemning India's actions on Indian-occupied Kashmir. We heard the High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet has already expressed strong concerns over these human rights violations and the communication blackout. In fact, she's also in her recent statement talked about how those 1.9 million Muslims in Assam have been left out of the National Registry of Citizens, and that is a big concern. Now, India calling itself a democracy, the question we're looking into is it even a democracy anymore? Why aren't international journalists allowed in these locales? And what effect, if any, will this latest diplomatic push from Pakistan on the UNHRC Geneva session today have on the international spectrum? Let me now introduce our guests who are joining us from our Ahmedabad studios. We have with us a former ambassador, Mr. Asif Durrani, and from New Delhi, we have the National Secretary of the Social Democratic Party of India, Dr. Taslim Rehmani. Welcome to both of you to the show. I want to start with you, Ambassador. If we are to talk about this latest statement, there's a whole it's a very long 8 to 10 minute speech that Mr. Shah Mahmood Qureshi gave, but the salient points are pretty much what Pakistan has been addressing, that this curfew, this blackout of communication is causing a lot of duress on Kashmiris. What, in your opinion, could be the reaction from the world stage from this statement?
I think it's just not a foreign minister's speech, but since 5th August, the international media has been continuously reporting about the lockdown in Indian-occupied Kashmir, where 8 million people do not have the liberty to move out. They do not have the liberty to go to hospitals or to come out on the streets to perform their normal chores or their religious obligations. Media is completely, as you yourself have said in your intro, they have been almost shut down. They cannot, and international media, with great difficulty, they have the opportunity to report about the complete lockdown, and eventually it has become a concentration camp. So in that context, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi has reiterated what has been and repeated what has been the case since 5th of August. While from Pakistan's perspective, it is an occupied and disputed territory, the normal life in the occupied Kashmir has become more miserable with the abrogation of Article 370. And in that respect, the Indian policymakers, they are pursuing an agenda which is more militarist and which reflects a muscular majority, and I think this is very dangerous. Not only for the Kashmiris, for their life and for their liberty, but also since it's a disputed territory, it has become dangerous between Pakistan and India.
Right.
So, and unfortunately, we do not find any way, whether at the bilateral plane or at the multilateral level, that something is to be done to.
Ambassador Durrani, let me ask you this then. What we're hearing now is that even the US President Donald Trump has come back and said, after his last statement, which was given after meeting Prime Minister Modi in France, in the G7 summit, on the sidelines of the G7 summit, where he said, well, it's a bilateral issue, Pakistan and India was sorted out. But now what we're hearing in his recent statement is that he's still here, that offer to mediate is still there. What do you make of that?
Well, he has been making these offers, well, that is what I can say about that. But my personal view is that while we should welcome international mediation, basically it is Pakistan and the Kashmiri people who will have to fight for the right of self-determination of the Kashmiri people. And so far, and for the past 7 decades, Kashmiris have proved that they have not accepted Indian occupation. Whether Indians like it or not, they have tried to convince the Kashmiris through strong arm methods, through mollification, through whatever means they have tried. But they have failed. They have failed to make them good Indians. And then they have tried to integrate Kashmir into the Indian Union. They have again failed because people are not ready. People have rejected the Indian efforts to.
But Ambassador Durrani, let me again ask you this question. I mean, I want to rephrase a little in context to what the Foreign Minister of Pakistan said in this session here in Geneva to the UNHRC panel there. He essentially highlighted certain points about how the media, the international media has covered, and he took names of reports that have been shocking the world, such as the BBC report from late August, which showed the kind of atrocities that the military was handing out. And also this meeting with Prime Minister Modi and President Donald Trump, where Donald Trump, who had earlier said, I have been offering my mediation, basically turned around and took his words back, took a bit of a U-turn, so to speak. This was 26th August, right? On the sidelines of the G7 summit. Since 26th August till today, 10th September, at a session also in UNHRC, the issue of Kashmir and the kind of human rights violations has only escalated. The number of reports have only gone up. The evidence has only gone up. Do you think this might have anything to do with the fact that finally President Trump is banking on pressurizing India to take a different approach?
But then I'll have a counter question that Mr. Donald Trump has been changing his positions. We welcomed earlier when he said he's ready to mediate. He, in fact, disclosed to us that Prime Minister Modi, in fact, wanted mediation between Pakistan and India, and to which President Donald Trump expressed his readiness. And then after meeting Prime Minister Modi, he said it's a bilateral issue. Now he's again, but at the same time, in the same breath, he said that his mediatory offers are very much there on the table. And now if the pressure builds up through the media, maybe he can change his mind. But the issue is, basically, it would be India and Pakistan which will have to iron out these differences, because India will have to realize that they cannot subjugate the Kashmiris against their will. And this has been proven even after imposition of strict curfew and lockdown. They can very well see.
Okay. So let me ask Dr. Rehmani about your take on this. Let me get your opinion also, Dr. Rehmani. When you look at the situation as is being reported, not just by Indian media, but international media, what is your opinion on how the BJP-led government in India is now coming across to the world?
You see, whatever information we are getting about Jammu and Kashmir, it is totally the total lockdown. Number one, and there are protests from the people during the Friday prayer and other things. And today, being the Ashura Day, there were big processions announced, and all of that area is under curfew. Today is the first day when there is an announced curfew in Badgam area near Srinagar, and they are not allowed to take out the procession. We take it like the total violation of the human right. As we see, the right to internet is also a right, a fundamental right of the people as an essential service. And those essential services has been stopped by our government, and we are demanding to restore that as immediately as possible, because the landline phones are no more with most of the people. There are only a few landlines available at home, which even if you restore them, this serves no purpose. Furthermore, I want to tell you that even the people, the leaders who put under house arrest, there is no formal house arrest orders. They are just told verbally that you are under house arrest. There are no papers, there are no orders from any court, and they are not formally arrested. Mr. Taragami, a CPI MLA from Srinagar, was also under house arrest. He was sick. He has been shifted from Srinagar hospital to the Delhi hospital. Even here in New Delhi, the CPM leaders are not allowed to meet him, and after much of the fuss, they have given some time to some leaders to meet him in the hospital to visit. So this situation, we take it that it's a total curb, it's a denial of democratic rights. This is the denial of democracy as well as the human rights. And this is what
but
we
Dr.
are
Rehmani, do you think,
loudly here.
While there are protests, and SDPI has been very vocal in expressing these concerns about their Kashmiri brethren, but also, do you think with the BJP-led government since 2014, in fact, there has been a discrimination, or so to speak, against minorities?
You see, the discrimination against minorities is going on not since 2014, but much earlier. Even the Congress era and the BJP era, both are not different. The only difference is that during the BJP era, it's much more announced and vocal discrimination. Earlier, it was a hidden discrimination. Only this much is the difference. Otherwise, there was a discrimination. There is no doubt about that. The SDPI has taken out the protest rallies for the citizens of Kashmir. We said that if you want to abrogate Article 370 or 35, then you must have to ask to take the opinion of the state subjects who are the actual Kashmiris. This is a let-down law of our land. Indian Constitution says that any bifurcation of the state or abrogation of any special status, you have to take into consideration the opinion of that particular state. It's not the Jammu and Kashmir alone. There are 11 other states which are covered by under this Article 371. They enjoy the special status. The same way the Kashmir under Article 370 is enjoyed that similar special status. So if you want to abrogate them, you have to ask their opinion. And if you are not asking it with a pushing, with a shocked way, you are coming undemocratically inside the parliament at the 11th hour, and you distribute the copy of the bill even after the commencement of the session. Then it becomes undemocratic.
It becomes undemocratic, but also let me ask you this, Dr. Rehmani, what our guest ambassador was saying here is that this is something that Pakistan and India will have to iron out between themselves, referring to the foreign minister's speech today in the United Nations Human Rights Commission Geneva session. Do you think this is a possibility, considering the kind of tensions that exist now between India and Pakistan?
You see, we always maintain that Kashmir is a disputed issue between the two nations, that is India and Pakistan, and it must be resolved through negotiation. This was the stated stand always. But the 2014 onward, the present BJP government has denied to accept it as a bilateral issue, and they always said that it is a unilateral internal issue of India. But now every country of the world is saying, even the United States Security Assembly in its special session said it's a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, so it must be resolved through negotiation. Ultimately, we as an SDPI still appeal to both the country, to our country and to the neighboring Pakistan to use maximum refrain and normalize the situation so as the dialogue can be initiated, and the opinion of the Kashmiris must be considered.
Okay. So, Ambassador Durrani, let me come to you then. With the kind of attention that the BJP-led government has essentially brought on after the abrogation of Article 370, the kind of question that are being asked across journalists forums is that why aren't international journalists allowed if the locals are biased or they are not giving the correct picture? Wouldn't it make more sense in portraying the kind of normalcy India is talking about, allowing international observers or even international journalists across?
Well, your question carries the answer. Reason is that the action taken by Mr. Modi's government is actually, it reflects unfortunately to that fascist tendency, which in fact which believes in lies and deceits. Now they are telling the world that situation in occupied Kashmir is normal. I mean, I just see, how untrue this statement is. And then Mr. Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor, a day before yesterday, he made a statement which was a ridiculous statement, telling that he made it conditional, the lifting of lockdown or curfew from the occupied state as conditional to Pakistan's behavior. I mean, it's just like a policeman's mentality. He probably, since he has not been a diplomat, he has just reflected the mentality of a policeman, telling the world that, and it's a blackmailing tactics. And like the policemen in South Asia, they do that, they arrest a victim and then they tell the relatives that to convince the victim that he will have to behave or he will have to confess. This is, a crude form of, diplomacy as well as policy which has been pursued in the occupied state. And now, when the world media tells some truth about, because they have no full access to the occupied state, when they tell something about it, so here the Indian media, which is now almost completely embedded, they say that the international media is lying. I mean, this is something that they have created a situation which is very dangerous, which is actually, we are talking about the lives and liberty of 8 million people. They have no access to the outside world. They have no access to health facilities. They have no access to education or normal life. Mm-hmm. So, and this is just reminiscent of Auschwitz camp, which was being run. And then Nazi Germany was telling the world that it is for the welfare of the Jews. So this is, there is a striking, resemblance with the two situations. So the world has to divert their attention towards these kind of atrocities in this 21st century, where we sit in a push-button age where nothing is hidden and the whole world knows it within seconds. Yes, Ayza.
Dr. Rehmani, let me get your take on this. So we live in a push-button age, as Ambassador just said. It is a very concerning situation, especially when news reports come in, and one today has just surfaced about a false flag operation that has been exposed on part of the BJP-led government, trying to make it look like they were being attacked in Sir Creek. Now, we've heard various accounts of these kind of false flag operations. The real tension really is that it could trigger a whole outpour, which would cost not just Pakistanis and Indians, but also the Kashmiris. Once again, the issue would go in the backdrop. Your comments, please.
Ultimately, there will be a dialogue, and we will push for a dialogue. Although we don't want to internationalize this issue, and we want that both the countries shall sit together. But until and unless this warmongering from various corners and the kind of statement both the leaders from both the countries are making, from the Indian side or the Pakistani side, I think we shall normalize our tones and tenure in our speaking, so that the conducive atmosphere can be created about the.
So you're saying it should be within India and Pakistan, it should be internationalized, but right now we are seeing it being internationalized to the extent that there are reports of 4,000 people who have been put under arrest under the Public Safety Act that is imposed there in occupied Kashmir. And there are also reports coming, as the foreign minister said, referring to the dossier which was presented at the UNHCR meeting, that chemical weapons are being used by the Indian Army.
Yes, there is a very clear report through international media. There it is 4,000 to 6,000 people who has been put under PSA, Public Safety Act. But the use of chemical weapons is not there. There is a pellet gun use which has been indiscriminately used on the protesters during the Friday prayers. While our forces has claimed that not a single bullet has been fired, but we objected to that statement stating that the pellet gun is equally like a bullet which is creating the permanent disabilities to the receivers of such bullets. So that is indiscriminate and inhuman use that must have to be stopped, and so many civil society organizations and political groups are demanding to stop that kind of a use. And even we are not allowed to inside, even I am not allowed to go inside and meet the people there. They blame us that you will be using your tone and you will create disturbances through your speeches, etc. Though only we want to go to on the humanitarian assistance, because there is no food, there is no baby food, there is no medicine like the blood pressure and the sugar, etc. Only for that purpose we want to go to meet the people and provide this kind of relief, but we are not allowed inside. So we are demanding that if everything is normal, then why we are not allowing inside? So this becomes a human right violation, and it's an issue of human right for a big population like that, for around 8 million people inside an open prison living over there. So this is an issue the community, the world communities and both the countries must consider very sympathetically in a human way.
In a human way. But Ambassador, when we talk about the world community, we've been talking to you about this on Newswire as well, that the lack of empathy that has been shown by world leaders, just in statements that we are watching closely, we are monitoring the situation. How far does it go?
Well, I think it will take a while, the reason being that because then it's also getting dangerous. Because as Dr. Rehmani has pointed out, with regard to the line of control, India has escalated firing. And for us, the dilemma is that when Pakistan has to respond, it has to be careful, because on the other side also they are Kashmiris. For us, it's a dilemma. And we have to exercise caution. But coming to the international reaction or international leaders, their silence, it is coming out. It's not that they are completely silent, because even at the bilateral level with Mr. Modi during G7 summit and elsewhere, even the Indian president has been visiting Geneva, Switzerland and all that. These violations have been raised. And it is now a permanent talking point with the Indians by the international community, that they are asking about the human rights violations, in Kashmir. So it is coming up. But so yes, the pace is slow.
The pace is slow. I understand from that point of view that the pace is slow because clearly Kashmir is not the only region that is facing this kind of turmoil. But it's been 70 years, the conflict has gone unresolved, and the past 3 decades have been the most brutal. I mean, there were 2 very strong reports that the UN Human Rights Watchdog produced this year and last year that highlighted the kind of atrocities that take place under the garb of, oh, we are providing security to the Kashmiris. That is by the Indian military there. Now, as the situation unfolds and these statements that are coming out, even the UN HRC head chief, Ms. Michelle, she came out and said that this is a grave concern. Do you think this could trigger any kind of ceasefire at a time where, like you said, across the line of control, there is also so much crossfire between the two countries?
The ceasefire can only come when Indian leadership will realize that this dispute has to be resolved through peaceful means. It was done in 2003 when Mr. Vajpayee was Prime Minister, and then there was an agreement by the two governments to stop, and it happened and it continued for almost 11 years until the new BJP government came into power in 2014. So unfortunately, this BJP government, which is heavily, influenced by the RSS, BJP, and Bajrang Dal combined, now they are calling the shots, and their agenda is just to, suppress those voices which they think that may be different from their point of view.
Okay.
So it is a dangerous situation. We have to forewarn the world. We have to be careful within our own borders, and we have to be watchful how they are behaving. In the occupied Kashmir, Mr. Rehmani has himself pointed out what kind of a lockdown and miseries are being, endured by the Kashmiris. Absolutely. He cannot visit that land, and it is he has described it as an open jail. So, these I think we don't have to invent the wheel to prove that atrocities are being perpetrated against the Kashmiri people.
Okay, Ambassador Durrani, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it at that. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much. And Dr. Taslim Rehmani, also, thank you for joining us here on Newswire. With that, we'll take a quick short break, but don't go away. When we're back, we will be talking about what U.S. in Iran and the tensions in the Middle East, where they've gotten to. Welcome back. I'm Ayza Omar and you're watching Newswire. Well, we talked about in the first segment how the US President Donald Trump had mentioned that he's still open with the idea of mediating over Kashmir between Pakistan and India. What he's also suggested in a separate statement is that he is ready to sit down and talk to Tehran about this ongoing standoff that has got the Middle East in a grip of tension for the past year now. So we will be discussing with our guests also the latest developments coming out from various news reports where samples taken by the United Nations nuclear watchdog at a facility in Tehran, they've essentially shown traces of uranium that Iran has yet to explain. Of course, uranium is a key element in the development of nuclear weapons. However, the International Atomic Energy Agency officials could not confirm whether these materials predated the 2015 nuclear deal or were more recent. Now, just to recap, the US pulled out of this nuclear deal last year when President Donald Trump, in trying to force Iran to essentially negotiate a more sweeping agreement covering more issues that he felt the JCPOA lacked, which was Iran's ballistic missiles, its regional behavior, and of course, the other subsections of the current accord. Now, it is important to mention here that even before President Trump pulled out of the deal last year, the International Atomic Energy Agency and the US intelligence services themselves believed that Iran had ended its nuclear weapons program more than 10 years before the deal. So the standoff continues, and with the latest statements coming from President Donald Trump and President Rouhani, what can we make of how it is going to move forward? Let me now introduce the guests who are joining us today. We have with us Mr. Mostafa Khoshcheshm, an analyst joining us from Tehran, And we have Mr. George Szamuely, Middle East expert, joining us from Budapest. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. Let me start with you, Mr. Khoshcheshm. The latest statement from President Donald Trump could sit down with Tehran to sort this out. In some reports, he said, I could sort this out within 24 hours if Tehran would agree. What do you make of this?
Well, of course, Donald Trump's words and even his promises are not worth even considering. The United States lacks credit for any kind of talks after they struck a deal with Iran and withdrew from the JCPOA after Iran complied with the terms for quite a long time. And the U.S., even President Obama never complied with any of the terms of the nuclear deal that his administration had struck. So basically speaking, the United States, and not just Donald Trump, lacks credit for any kind of talks. Who guarantees if talks end up in a deal that the deal would stay in place for quite a long time? Maybe the next administration and maybe Donald Trump himself would withdraw from this similar agreement. Having the endorsement of the Congress would play no good, because we have already seen quite a few agreements that had been endorsed by the Congress, but Donald Trump has also dropped out of those treaties like INF and many others. So basically, if the U.S. really cares about conflict resolution approach, they should get back to the nuclear deal. But the point is exactly in here, that the U.S. is not looking for a conflict resolution. They are practicing engagement for the sake of containing Iran's power components in various areas of nuclear industry, missile industry, regional power, and the list continues. Tehran now knows, after the game that they played in the nuclear deal, Tehran knows pretty well what their plans are and is not going to budge even for an inch.
Okay, so Mr. Szamuely, I mean, Mr. Khoshcheshm here says that President Donald Trump is not one whose words could always be relied upon. And there are, of course, a plethora of examples of why this is a world perception about the president who is also the supreme leader of the world's strongest country. So, I mean, is that something that one could have a problem with going into a possible deal? We're talking about Iran. It's facing a big recession in itself, and it's continuing its third step into defying the clauses of the JCPOA.
Yes, I don't doubt that Donald Trump would love to have a photo op of meeting President Rouhani, and thereby he can then present to the American people that here I am, I'm the deal maker, I'm the person who's trying to negotiate something, and these terrible, unreasonable Iranians refusing to come to any kind of an agreement with me. Now, Iran is obviously not going to fall into this trap. I mean, they tried to do this with the foreign minister Zarif. Come to the White House, and and then we'll work something out. He knew exactly that he was just being set up, so that when, of course, nothing happens as a result of the meeting, Iran will be blamed for any failure to come to an agreement. So that's just not on the cards. Trump, if he wished to do so, can do a lot of things right now to show his good faith and his desire to come to an agreement. I mean, he could first of all support the President Macron's $15 billion credit line.
But Mr. Szamuely, the question is that while we do doubt President Trump's intentions and we doubt the credibility of his statements, which he is very famous for taking U-turns, but at the same time, anything he says goes a long way. And I mean, just look at how the Afghan US Taliban talks, negotiations came to a grinding halt with him just tweeting that we're calling it off. We're not having this secret meeting in Camp David.
Well, exactly. And it's a pattern with President Trump. Remember, he walked away from a possible agreement with North Korea. Now, with North Korea, he at least has maintained since then at least personal cordial relations with Kim Jong-un. He did the same in Syria. He made a grand announcement, we're withdrawing all our troops, we're done, we've beaten ISIS, we're out of here. Nothing happened. So now the same thing with Afghanistan. And this is not the first time that he's promised a withdrawal from Afghanistan. He said that in 2017. And said, well, I've been persuaded by the military to stay on. So again, he says these things. He gets a lot of mileage. So, he's keeping his promises in 2016 that he's going to end all these entanglements. But in actual fact, he has actually done nothing. And he hasn't taken any of the concrete steps which would indicate that he wants to come to an agreement with Iran.
But then, Mr. Szamuely, do you think that what could have happened possibly, was that a missed opportunity, the G7 summit at the end of August in Biarritz, France, where the foreign minister of Iran did show up, Mr. Javad Zarif, on the invitation of the French? He could have possibly struck a conversation there, could have started some process.
Exactly. And if Trump were serious about resolving this dispute with Iran, then he would have seized this opportunity. This would have been a great thing. He would have said, President Macron has arranged this and we can work something out. But Trump really isn't even prepared to make the first step. I mean, just to remove some of the sanctions that he's imposed. We're not even talking about, going back to the JCPOA, but simply withdrawing some of these brutal sanctions he's imposed. He's not even prepared to do that. So what is the point of, any kind of a one-on-one meeting if he's not prepared to do anything?
Right. And so, Mr. Khoshcheshm, sanctions are the prerequisite for any conversation, according to President Rouhani, with President Trump on the matter of the ballistic missiles or the nuclear deal or whichever. But the question is that how realistic is it about these sanctions? Because these sanctions are essentially stopping these exports that Iran has always relied on. And we're talking about oil exports that are to the tune of 2.8 million barrels a day, which have now dropped to under 500,000. And now they're fighting over the oil tanker that has been seen 2.1 or so nautical miles from Tartus port in Syria. So there's a whole debate ongoing, with John Bolton also questioning that until Iran stops lying and spreading extremism, we're not going to have a conversation. Do you see any kind of breakthrough happening possibly between the two, maybe even in the back channel talks of that could possibly be going on?
Not back channel talks, but, after decades of hostile plans against Iran to enforce regime change, the United States failed and failed again. And they came up with the conclusion that they need to develop a strategy that they did from 2005 or 6 to 2008. They did that in order to contain Iran's power, at least in a clash of interest with the United States in the region, in the Middle East. This engagement strategy works on the basis of sanctions and posing credible military threat, as well as other pressures possible in order to push Tehran to the negotiating table and harness Iran's, power components in various areas of nuclear industry, missile industry, regional power, in order to contain Iran's power. And they did that with regard to the nuclear deal because Obama knew how to play the sanctions. To bring Tehran to the negotiating table, the main leverage is the sanctions. But the sanctions have always been in place. They have left negative impact. But this different use of sanctions as a weapon to push Tehran to the negotiating table, this has a very limited period because there is a limited period that sanctions could produce maximum result and leave much effect on the country's economy. Architects of the sanctions, as well as experts, believe that this period is somewhere between 1.5 years to 2 years. Considering that Donald Trump reimposed the sanctions and dropped out of the nuclear deal around 15 or 16 months ago, they have until this spring in order to push Iran back to the negotiating table. And considering that Iran has been under the peak of the sanctions for the last 3-4 months, and it has lived and survived the sanctions, they know that if Tehran would not budge, then the U.S. would lose its only weapon that it has developed against Iran and has worked to some extent by spring. And they don't want to do that. That would be a great loss for the United States.
But not only that, let's also mention here how the Indian President Hassan Rouhani said earlier last week, in fact, he warned that Iran would begin research on developing centrifuges to speed up. And now we're getting information that these centrifuges of the latest technology have been installed. So, I mean, there is a counterproductive measure to whatever President Trump is doing, that Iran will continue to go ahead and go against the JCPOA clauses. So, but then after a time, there's a big risk that it will lose what little support it gets from from other supporters or co-signatories of the JCPOA.
No, there is a misunderstanding here. Iran has not installed the newer generation of its centrifuge machines for industrial enrichment. It has installed them for test. This is the third phase of reduction of nuclear deal undertakings that Iran has announced in area of research and development. That's it. Iran is not going to use 164 centrifuge cascades for industrial enrichment. This installment is for the sake of research and development, and the third
research and development
contains,
of what?
The development on newer generation of centrifuge machines. This does not mean that they would work and operate in order to enrich uranium. They are under development, and research and development has been underway, even under the JCPOA, on newer generation of centrifuge machines. But there were some limitations that Iran has removed those limitations for research. That's the first thing to note. A second point here is that Iran exercised patience for quite a long time, even a year after the U.S. Exited the nuclear deal. And the U.S. and Europeans never complied with their undertakings and never changed the approach. There was some kind of equilibrium, a balance. On one hand, Iran was in full compliance. On the other hand, the Europeans did nothing, zilch. So Iran changed the approach, started active resistance diplomacy, and in a tit-for-tat policy, and it worked because it moved Macron and other Europeans to do something at least. There is no use standing and waiting. You need to get back your rights. Developing Iran's enrichment industry is Iran's right, and Iran should not wait for the other side to change approach.
But Mr. Khoshcheshm, even when France tried, even when France was trying with the credit line of 15 billion, given that it needed the approval of President Trump, but didn't the foreign minister of Iran pretty much threw that option out the window?
No, the point here is that that was, again, the United States. Macron was no one in that deal, or so-called deal of $15 billion credit line, because eventually, at the end of the day, this was Trump that should have issued the permit and the license for the crude sales of Iran. That's an unfortunate fact that Europeans are not independent, powerful actors in this deal. At least they need the permission of the United States. And one more point here is that as I was mentioning a couple of questions ago, you asked me about the sanctions impact. Our assessment here is that if Tehran continues the same approach, I mean, the resistance diplomacy, active resistance in a tit-for-tat policy, then the United States, which is not willing to lose the sanctions as a weapon, would start tactical retreats by December. We are rather sure about that they would start tactical retreats and put forward better options and even better and more charming proposals to Tehran. Then, at the end of autumn, you might not be surprised to hear that Donald Trump is offering the same thing that Macron was offering Tehran just last week.
So you've got the timeline figured out, Mr. Khoshcheshm. Let me get Mr. Szamuely's input here. Mr. Szamuely, do you see what Mr. Khoshcheshm is predicting will happen in the next few months? Do you agree with that?
Well, I actually don't think that the United States will make too many concessions. But that doesn't mean that Iran doesn't have quite a strong position right now. What has changed is the determination of Russia and China to ensure that Iran evades the sanctions regime, that Iran gets around the maximum pressure campaign. And I think that they will work out some kind of an agreement. I mean, China is already purchasing Iranian oil. And they will probably work out some system to get around the whole Instex thing and all the stuff that the Europeans are doing. Now, maybe they'll do it via direct barter. Maybe Russia will now sell Iranian oil on consignment. Maybe they'll use the yuan as a means of exchange. But I think that's the most likely. I think that Iran will just stop waiting for the Europeans to come around because that just isn't going to happen.
Because right now the Europeans are the reason why there is the latest sort of bone of contention, the Adrian Darya, the oil tanker, which has been at the center of a dispute between Tehran and Washington because allegedly it was delivering oil to the Syrian port of Tartus, that the US space technology firm photographed, said it was 2 nautical miles from it. And then John Bolton came out and said that, you know, this is an EU sanctioned country, you can't do that. And then you deny it. So you're really lying. I mean, like, how do you see this even a possibility that EU might figure out a way on how to deal with Iran when this is going on the sanctioned countries?
Well, it's important to remember that this whole talk about sanctions against Syria is a lot of nonsense. There are no sanctions. There are no EU sanctions on preventing Syria from importing oil. There just isn't. What there are sanctions on the EU importing oil from Syria, but there's no ban on Syrians importing oil. The EU couldn't do that anyway. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it's quite likely that the Europeans will take the path of least resistance. They'll see we don't really want to fight with the Americans over this, and they will say, look, Iran isn't really adhering to the JCPOA. Look, it's taken this step and this step and this step to withdraw from it. We don't need to fight for this. Okay. I think that's a likely scenario. But as I say, you know, the Iranians, I think, don't really need the Europeans so much anymore. I think once they have, Russia and China, 2 major powers in their corner, I think they can just simply say, the hell with it. That train has left the station. Right. And I think that very shortly, the JCPOA will be no more. It'll just be in the history books. It'll be in the history books. Mr. Khoshcheshm, I want to highlight another sort of argument, and this is from the sort of a point of view of what John Bolton has come out and said, that the concern is that Iran is violating all limits on nuclear research and development, and that basically proves his point, which he says that Iran retains massive uranium enrichment capacity. Like you said, that what is the guarantee that Donald Trump would stick to his words this time round? The same pretty much argument is of the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who says that how do we know that Iran is not going to once again violate if we come to a deal?
This seems to be a joke because those people who have, put an end to the nuclear deal are now talking about its violation. They are not really worried about the nuclear deal and Iran's nuclear capability. Otherwise, they would have stuck to the nuclear deal because the nuclear deal included the harshest ever regime of inspections imposed on any nation, member state of the IAEA. They include the voluntary implementation of the additional protocol to the NPT. That means this regime of inspections would remain in place 15 years after the 10-year-long JCPOA lasts. That is, they would have the widest ever.
So if you were to peel away from the... Okay, Mr. Khoshcheshm, we're running out of time, but if you were to sort of push aside the curtain of lame rhetoric, so to speak, what would you say is the real reason? I mean, I'm just going to sort of... I just want to hear what your idea is. Why the ballistic missiles, the nuclear program, why is it a threat to a country across the Atlantic?
They are not worried about themselves. First of all, they know that with this, pace that Iran is developing its power, who knows where it will be in about 10, 20 years. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, Iran was under the threat of the Taliban as well as Saddam Hussein 2 decades ago. Now, they claim that Iran is present everywhere in this region and very strategic parts of the region. It has won and earned victory in battles against the United States allies who fought Iranian allies through proxy forces with maximum power and money and weapon and whatever they had. But they failed again and again and again in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq. Everywhere Iran has been present and has been helping its allies, they have won. So who knows where Tehran will be in about 20 years from now. But for the time being, they're worried about Israel, and they are worried about their own interests in this energy-rich region.
We'll have to leave it at that, Mr. Khoshcheshm. We've unfortunately run out of time. I was very interested to get your answer also, Mr. Szamuely, but we'll have to stop it for now. We've come to the end of the program talking about how US-Iran tensions, a standoff between the two, has escalated the kind of the tensions in the Middle East region. We will be following up with more news and analysis on this topic in our coming episodes. But for now, goodbye.